Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, inspiration, and connections from all flavors of Passive House, check out passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your technical questions answered, and contribute to the community forum. There's loads of free information for experienced professionals and people just starting out on their Passive House journey. We hope to see you at one of our construction tech or weekly global Passive House showcase webinars. In the meantime, here's this week's Passive House podcast. Kia ora, welcome back to the Passive House podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler-Welsh, coming to you from New Zealand.
And I'm Zack Semke, coming to you from Seattle, Washington.
How's it going, Zack?
It's good. It's, that time of year where we're all kind of compressed, trying to get ready to take a little bit of time off for the holidays. How about for you?
Yeah, well, quite a lot of time for this part of the world. Tend to shut down for 3 weeks, around 2 or 3 weeks over Christmas and New Year. A lot of the building industry traditionally has kind of taken a good chunk of time off at that time of year. Less so these days. I think a lot more people do. I see a lot of building sites carry on through the Christmas and New Year break, but there certainly will be some people taking a bit of time off. And I think this is our last episode before Christmas.
It is indeed. Yes. So happy Christmas.
Yeah. And but we'll be going on through and having another. So we will have another episode before the new year, carrying on through to finish off a packed but very informative, inspiring year. So much appreciated for all the work that the team's done to put these together. We've got a great interview this week. I really enjoyed listening to Josh, and very excited to get into that and to have a bit of a chat about it. So we'll get into that. But before we do, let's thank some of our supporters.
Yes, indeed. So everything we do at the Accelerator comes thanks to the support of these fine organizations. So big thank you to our founding sponsors, 475 High Performance Building Supply, Baxt Inqui Architects, Glavel Foam Glass Gravel, Minitair All-in-One HVAC and Dehumidification Units, Mitsubishi Electric Train HVAC US, Partel, Rockwell North America, Stocorp, and Zola Windows. Thanks to our champion sponsors, Icon Windows and Doors, Intelligent Membranes, Proseco, and Source 2050. And a big thank you to our stakeholder partner, NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority.
Awesome. All right. Well, should we get into it? You want to tell us a bit about Josh Salinger?
Yeah. So Josh Salinger is the CEO and founder of Birdsmouth Design-Build in Portland, Oregon. And I have known Josh for many years. We served on the Passive House Northwest board together a few years ago. And as you'll see hear in the beginning of the interview, we swam in the same pond for a while there in Portland.
Were you at Hammer and Hand together? Were you there at the same time?
No, I was at Hammer in Hand while he was discovering Passive House and starting his business of Birdsmouth. So he was never at Hammer in Hand, but he was roommates with the kind of master woodworker Dan Palmer, who we'll mention in the interview. Who was at Hammer in Hand and has also, knows all the guys and was seeing what was going on there. And so it was definitely a walk down memory lane for me.
Yeah.
So we get into that a little bit and then a bunch about just, his really inspiring mission driven work. So I hope everyone enjoys it. I have Josh Salinger here, who is the founder and CEO of Birdsmouth Design-Build. I'm super excited to have you on the Passive House podcast, Josh. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. I mean, big admirer of your work, and I have my Passive House roots in Portland, and you're based in Portland, Oregon. So it's I'm one of the things I'm really looking forward to doing is like getting the scoop on what's going on and what may be going on and not going on in Portland right now. But before we do that, I'd love to dive in a little bit into how you got to where you're at now. Like what got you involved in construction in the first place, and why Passive House construction specifically?
Yeah, well, there's a long story and a short one, so I'll try to split the middle there. But
Perfect.
getting into construction, when I was younger, I grew up in northern Wisconsin, and my dad used to work for a chain of banks there. So it was this kind of high pressure, stressful, job that he had. And for whatever reason, he loved to blow off steam, build things. So we had a lake house that we'd go to on the weekends and summers and stuff, about an hour and a half drive from where I went to high school, and we lived most of the time. And, there'd be a new pier that had to be built, or he wanted to put a deck around the house, or we'd want to refinish the basement. And so, he'd be listening to the Milwaukee Brewers. It'd be summertime, and I'd be hanging out with Dad, and he's in a good mood, having a good time. And it was just kind of fun, right, to like build all these things. And so I kind of really garnered an interest and a passion in just building from that, because it was just a pleasant thing to do with my dad. And so fast forward some, I ended up, I've always kind of had an ethos around sustainability, and I don't really know where that came from, but it's always, even early on in my life, I can look back and say, wow, I was really kind of keyed into this. And I ended up going to school in Madison, Wisconsin for biological conservation and ecology is a degree that I got. And after that, I ended up kind of bouncing around various jobs. There wasn't much to find in that field unless you wanted to be out in the deep woods of Idaho, fighting over, a job that 100 other people wanted for no money, that kind of thing.
Right.
So I ended up just kind of working in restaurants, bartending, traveling around the world, stuff like that, things people do in their early 20s. Ended up, moving into a house full of guys here in Portland, Oregon. This is the short version of the story. And you probably know some of these people. Dan Palmer, he used to work at Hammer and Hand.
Oh, yeah.
Worked with him back in the day.
Yeah, really fantastic woodworker and craftsman. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the best woodworkers I've had the pleasure to meet, for sure. He does some beautiful Passive House windows. And anyways, he was just my roommate. He was a guy who I met and was living with. And right about that time, Hammer and Hand was just starting to kind of kick off. This is kind of right before they got into the whole Passive House thing, or right around that time. And so anyways, moved in with him and some other friends, and they had all these tools. And I was like, oh my God, I used to love this stuff. I used to love carpentry. And they were building stuff. And I remember Dan had gone out to apply for this job, and that was the Hammer and Hand job. And I ended up kind of getting into it. And so I'd be bartending at night, and during the day, I'd be doing carpentry projects kind of for fun, which kind of blended into kind of helping Dan do some stuff, visiting some early Hammer and Hand projects. And since I was bartending, I'd meet people across the other side of the bar that would be like, oh, I'm wanting to build a deck or a fence or something like that. And I'd be like, oh, I could do that for you. And so that deck and a fence grew into a bathroom, which grew into kitchens, which grew into, eventually I had this contract for a 4-story condo renovation. And this would have been around 2008 or something like that.
Right.
And I got into this project. I ended up leaving that bartending gig because I realized that I could kind of put together all these, like this love of craft and carpentry, plus the ethos of green building, which around that time was really starting to take off. It was early days. It was still kind of passive solar, people focusing on low VOC materials and reclaimed lumber and stuff like that. And so I realized I could kind of put that together in a way that I could also generate a living at the same time. And I was looking to get out of the bartending restaurant industry anyways. I was expecting my first kid around that same time. Ended up kind of putting it all together and striking off my own, took on this large condo project where I completely failed. The project was great. Turned out really nice. The clients to this day still love it. They still refer us. But what they don't know is that I ended up taking a $50,000 HELOC just to finish the project because
Oh man,
I
yeah,
underbid it. I didn't know what I was
Yeah,
doing when it came
of
to
course.
business.
Yeah,
Yeah. So, I learned real quickly. Now I look back at that and I say, well, that was my education. I paid for my schooling
right,
through that experience. But through that, I learned like, oh, I need to really take the business of this seriously. I need to put down my bags and I need to delegate. And I really started to get into just reading everything I could find about running a business and how to make that work. And so, spent the next couple of years working on that and kind of doing the whatever green building, kind of in quotes, that we could do. And right around, I want to say it was 2012 or something like that, the city of Portland had a green building tour. They don't do it anymore. But I remember going on it, and there was a guy named Rob Hawthorne. I don't know if you know that name.
Oh yeah, from PDX Living. Is that right? Yeah.
Exactly. He had somehow found out about one of the early, Fias, Katrine back in the day. He ended up in Champaign-Urbana at one of the early trainings at Katrine's house. And he came back and ended up building this passive house here in Portland right around 2012. And it was on this tour. And I walked into this thing and it was just mind-boggling to me. It just opened up my brain. I was just like, wait a minute, this is science-based. This is performance-based. There's triple pane windows here. Everything's airtight. He had a Zender in there. And I remember thinking like, what is this thing? And just all the explanations and everything, it took my, my love of science and facts. I have a degree from University of Wisconsin-Madison, Bachelor of Science. And so there was this like science-based understanding that was aimed at buildings and actually making them perform in a way that was hugely impactful. It was answering like, I never quite felt right about the green building thing. It's like, okay, we could use some clay paint here, but it never really felt like it was fully realized in my head. And I walked into that building and everything just kind of opened up from there. I was like, oh, this is the thing. This is where the actual work is being done, where people are doing science and they're proving it. And this building is going to last a really long time and it's going to be healthy and it's super comfortable and, all the things. And so from that point forward, that's right around the time that I believe Hammer and Hand was doing some of their first passive house projects when Skylar was part.
Yeah, that's right.
And Dan Whitmore was working for them. You were there. I think you were there right around the same time.
Yeah. I joined in 2009. So yeah, and I know the tour you're talking about. I didn't actually attend that tour because by then I was in Seattle, but I know the tour well that you're describing. Because it had been, I
always meant to look back on the exact date of that. I want to get the dates correct. Because if you were at Hammer and Hand already,
2012 sounds right in terms of when Rob Hawthorne would have been showing the building to me.
It makes sense.
That sounds about right. Yeah.
Yeah, it makes sense from like when Katrine would have been doing that too. So
yeah.
So yeah, and it was just super heady days, right? I mean, there was like Hammer and Hand was just leading the charge, with Sam Hagerman and everything that was happening there. And, they're doing these beautiful projects, the Pumpkin Ridge Passive House, the Karuna House. They did the Glasswood commercial project
Glasswood's right. Yep. On Division in Portland. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so it was just watching them was just fascinating, And so I went to a Fias conference in San Francisco right around that time. And then at that point, that's when I first, met Joe Steebrook and met like folks like, the folks from Artisans Group, Tessa, Bradley at the time. Just kind of really, really got into it from that point forward. And I remember just thinking like, this is what we need to do. And we ended up, I was talking about it constantly, probably to my wife's chagrin, just passive house. And it was kind of one of those things where like, if you talk about it enough, you can kind of like eventually it just kind of happens, And so we had met a client who was looking to build a new house, and I kept talking. He was from Sweden, and so he was actually asking for a lot of these tilt turn windows and stuff because that's what he was used to back in Sweden. And so that turned out to be a nice lever to be able to get him to go towards Passive House. That first one we did was back in 2013, 14, something like that. It didn't get certified. I tried to go for the certification, but at the time the client wasn't having it. So it ended up being Earth Advantage, a local nonprofit building certification group here, Zero Energy certified. But it had it had Zola windows, triple pane Zolas. We used 3 inches of exterior cork on this thing. We had zip system.
Cool.
We had a Zender in there. Looking back, it would have quite easily qualified, for the FIAS program. And so that was the first one we kind of like bit our teeth, cut our teeth in, and from there. We did our first certified project back in 2015, was a design build thing that we designed and then built, the Emerson Street Passive House. And then from there, we did another one in 2018. And, now, we're pretty into it. We have 3, certified, new builds happening right now, all going for FIA certification. So,
Awesome.
Yeah, the ball just kind of been gathering speed, and that's kind of how it all started. That's the short version. There's clearly ups and downs in life that happened in between there too.
Yeah, right. Well, it's a really great story and super fun for me to listen to too, because I know so many of the names that you just mentioned, lots of really great people. And it was a very heady time for sure. And I think at that time, there was a sense of Portland being one of the kind of hotbeds of Passive House practice, and I guess it could be good news or bad news, but I think good news that there are a lot of other regions now that have kind of eclipsed what's been going on in the Northwest. I think Seattle has a kind of a similar story, but which I want to get to definitely. So maybe just before we get into that. Can you talk a little bit more about Birdsmouth, your design build, like why design build? Is that and like is that related also to your kind of philosophy around Passive House delivery? What sort of staff do you have? Like how big is your staff, and what's your portfolio like? Be great to hear some of that.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'll do a quick plug because I just wrote an article about design build, and it's in this month's Fine Home Building magazine.
Nice.
December 2022, Fine Home Building, and it's about design build. And we did make the change when we first started Birdsmouth. It was called Birdsmouth Construction, and we worked for a lot of third-party architects. And about 8 or so years ago, we changed it to Birdsmouth Design-Build. And largely because we were just finding ourselves getting frustrated with, the process of the design, bid, build, and getting plans landing on our desk that were just too far along the process to make any real, cost-effective changes to be able to meet a really high-performance building. I felt like lots of times, like we were just kind of like poo-pooing architects' designs and making things more expensive for the sake of green building, because these plans would show up on our desk and it was just too late to create a cost-effective air barrier or continuous insulation, or the clients would have their hearts set on a particular design. So that was frustrating. Or we'd find that we'd find a client early on that wanted this, and we'd find a third-party architect, and we'd spend so much time educating these architects about these details and kind of drawing them ourselves and just doing so much work just to be able to get this design in a way that would be buildable and, in a cost-effective way. And eventually we just were like, threw our hands in the air. We're like, well, what are we doing? Let's just do this ourselves, And so there was someone in our team at the time, Ben Valentine, who has been with me from the very early days. I think I hired him when we first opened the company in 2008 or 9. He's been with us. He still is. He's one of our designers in his CPHC. And he ended up taking on kind of that early design work that we did. And that's when we did that first Emerson Street Passive House, when we were able to actually, from its inception, work with the client based on this goal of meeting Passive House and trying to find ways to site it on this lot that were not only, efficient and durable and resilient and all those good things that come with Passive House, but also cost effective to build, and for our specific team too, right? So there might be 20 perfectly good ways to do any wall assembly, but our team was efficient at the way it was used to doing it. And so we were able to design it for our team. And we were able to leverage that, kind of muscle memory of our team, lessons learned from before, and design from the very inception this constructability, buildability, and have that design build feedback, iterative design process happening. And, after that, we never really looked back. So, there have been some exceptions that prove the rule. And maybe we can get into this later, but we're doing one of our projects right now is for a third-party architect, and it is getting certified to FIAS, but we're having to go through some pretty extreme lengths to get to that, just due to form and kind of orientation of the building. So very, basic and early on schematic design,
right,
kind of missed opportunities, I suppose. So anyway, our team, we focus on custom residential. We are a team of about 15 people. So we have myself, we have a project manager, a couple of site managers. We have 3 people on the design team, so architects and designers. We've got an office manager full-time. And then from there, we've got a bunch of different carpenters at varying levels, from lead carpenters to kind of journeyman carpenters through to apprentices and stuff like that. So not a huge team. And we actually we work fairly, I'd say almost use the word aggressively to stay this size, because there's lots of opportunities to really grow. But what we realized kind of strategically years ago was that, we can have more of an impact. I guess I should back up a little bit and say that the mission of our company is to address climate change through the built environment. That is why we are in business. And that's why folks in my team are, on this team and working towards this common goal. And so, we just, we're always trying to, I forgot where I was going with this, but,
you were talking about staying a certain size.
Yeah. We realized that we were able to, evangelize our mission and do better. We could build 3 passive houses a year here in Portland, Oregon, and no one would ever know about it. But if we stay the size we are and we give ourselves space to get out there and go to conferences and put on talks and write articles and participate in whatever it might be, we can really broadcast a lot of our lessons learned and mistakes and tricks and really do more promoting that mission through this versus just trying to grow in terms of like dollars or projects or number of people or those kinds of things. Because and it's proven to be pretty successful. The company, we're profitable and we have great people, adults that do good work, and I'm able to have the time to do things like this where I can spend my it's a Tuesday afternoon talking with you and hopefully getting good information out there. So
absolutely, that's really inspiring, Josh, and super important. And I mean, I know you mentioned the Fine Home Building article that you wrote. There was also, I think, Fine Home Building followed you for a story around the concrete-free slab on grade foundations, kind of innovation that you've been pioneering, and you presented on the Passive House Accelerator Construction Tech Program about that concrete-free slab on grade foundations approach, which was a super popular event and also a really popular video now in our archive. I'm sure there's lots more that you've been doing, and I know that you also brought on Ryan Shanahan, right, from Earth Advantage. And you mentioned when we were just before we were going to start that he's involved with a podcast on fine home building, right? Can you say a bit about that one?
Yeah. Well, so I'll back up just a second about Ryan Shanahan. We we get together with the heads of each part of each department in our company every year, and we have a strategic meeting and talk about where we want to go, how did we do last year, what do we want to look like in 5 years' time. And oftentimes we'll talk about like what can we do environmentally. A few years back, we decided to use no foam above grade, things like that. And this last year, we were like, well, if we're being serious about our mission, we have to take existing buildings seriously. And so we're like, well, how do we go about doing this? We could start getting into energy retrofits and decarbonizing the existing built environment. And I was like, gosh, we're going to need to find some unicorn to if we're going to launch a program like this that really understands buildings, knows people in the industry. Retrofits are difficult. And so anyways, Ryan Shanahan used to work at Earth Advantage for about 13 years. And he and I used to go out and grab a beer semi-regularly every couple of weeks, just because he lives near me and, like-minded guy, good guy. And so I was just kind of, belly aching about this, like, hey, we really want to start this program and we're just trying to find someone. And I look over the rim of my beer and he's sitting there waving his arms in the air, like he's like pointing at himself.
Pass it to me. Pass it to me.
Yeah. And I was just like, I don't know that I blew my beer out of my mouth, but that was the proverbial, like, thing that happened. Really didn't see that coming because he'd been Earth Advantage for so long.
Yeah.
And it was like, wow, are you serious? And he's like, no, I've been thinking about making a change. Earth Advantage is making some changes, and the timing was right. So we ended up bringing him on, and which has been absolutely wonderful. And we're about 6-8 months in to getting this retrofit division, I suppose, of our company going, so that we can really try to decarbonize existing buildings. And so he's leading that and doing a wonderful job with it. And as part of that, we're doing a podcast, which is going to be launching in January. And in fact, as we're speaking right now, he is interviewing Allison Bales,
awesome.
The second person on his podcast.
Right.
So it's going to be called the Retrofit Podcast, and it's going to be through Fine Home Building Magazine and Green Building Advisor. And that's going to be launching in early 2023. So really looking forward to that. And again, it goes back to what I was saying about us wanting to be able to evangelize and share this knowledge that we're discovering to a wider range of people than we could ever do just here in lowly Portland, Oregon. And with that retrofit podcast, we don't know that we have answers because these things are so complicated, but we want to start the conversation, and we hope that the conversation will blossom into some new ideas, or maybe get someone to think in a slightly different way. And hopefully we won't be delivering, like I said, answers here, but hopefully generating good ideas and getting the conversation out there, and really trying to wrap our heads around how can we deal with all these, every one of these buildings is completely unique. Has had different renovations over the years, has got different, priorities, whether that be budget or, climate goals or comfort goals or whatever, and trying to get this shoehorned into 5 simple steps or something like that.
Right.
We're not there yet, but that's the goal, high level.
Yeah. That's, I'm looking forward to following the podcast. That's going to be great. And it's just, you're right. It's such a critically important problem to solve, and not an easy one to solve, and really interesting. So that's fantastic. So, and you've mentioned clear mission-driven company and the focus on decarbonization, and Passive House is clearly a really important piece of that for you. In these, you mentioned that you're working on 3 Passive House projects. What other elements are you bringing into your kind of conception of decarbonization in addition to Passive House? You mentioned foam free, the commitment to foam free above foundation. What would, like, embodied carbon clearly is on your mind. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. That's the obvious thing, right? Is the embodied carbon. And in fact, recently we've started on our title block on all of our plans. we've put an embodied carbon schedule on the front. So it'll have like, the jurisdictional mandated energy requirements that you have to meet. And then we'll have our, how we're meeting them, and it's blown out of the water because we're doing zero energy or passive house. But then we're putting a schedule below it where we actually been using the beam carbon calculator and running our projects through that and putting those results there right on the front page. And the goal is like, no one will know what it is at the plans review department, but maybe it'll get people to start kind of thinking about it, and it's been interesting. The concrete free slab was, a way that we were hoping to reduce our embodied carbon, and we've been doing a bunch of that. And we're also trying to remain critical and not get locked into any one idea too. We're actually questioning the concrete free slab. Is it actually, can we come up with a crawl on grade? So it's like a conditioned crawl on grade foundation that actually uses less gravel. Because what we found is there's like a lot of cost and a lot of environmental impact to using gravel. And when you're using the concrete free slab, using a lot more gravel, especially if you're building on a site that's somewhat sloped, because you have to build that back up. And then framing off the gravel can be tricky for our team too. And so we're trying to make things cost effective, because if we're going to make an impact and really get this movement of zero energy and passive house buildings moving forward, we have to make them cost effective too. And so we don't want to get, just because it's a popular idea. And I do think there's a time and a place for the concrete free slab on grade. I really do. But we don't want to just assume that that's always the answer and constantly be, critiquing ourselves. And that's one of the beauties of design build, is that we've got the builders and the designers there, and we're just talking about this stuff in the office and critiquing ourselves. And we're coming up with some interesting ideas about ways to kind of create a foundation that'll use very little concrete and less gravel for those sites that are not necessarily just flat. I mean, what we're finding, short answer, is that the concrete free slab on grade works really good on a nice flat site. But if you get any slope, you end up having to import a whole bunch of gravel. It makes the framing a little more difficult. There's the environmental impacts to that. So maybe there's a better way.
Right.
And so we're using the beam carbon calculator to calculate, okay, well, if we're going to do a conditioned crawl, there's going to be more foam involved in that. And what's the impact to that compared to a concrete free slab on grade? And so we're, also looking at the concrete that we're using. We recently did a case study with the Oregon DEQ around the slag entrained concrete. So we're able to reduce our embodied carbon of the concrete by 50%. So we've got a really interesting case study through the Oregon DEQ. I'd be happy to share that with you if you want to put it up on the accelerator somewhere.
Absolutely. Yeah. We can, and a link in this web episode too. Yeah.
Yeah. And so when we are using concrete, we're also trying to reduce its impact too. And looking at some future potential for some of the biochar concrete, some fascinating stuff happening there that we might incorporate in the next year or two. But the point is we're always trying to rake through these ideas, assemblies, and find ways that we can, the beam tool has been wonderful to actually put numbers to these things. And it's a good weather vane to say, well, we know that this material is better than that material. I don't know that we can hang our hats on these numbers, but what we can say is that the wind is blowing in this direction, and I think we should head that direction, so it's been really good for that. Just constantly trying to one up ourselves to find ways to cost effectively produce these things with lower embodied carbon on top of the benefits of the operational carbon that Passive House generates.
Yeah. So back to Portland. So you were talking about the scene that was happening, 10 years ago, that whole deal. What's the scene like now? What's going on with Passive House and specifically, but also the broader movement towards zero carbon building? I mean, is there energy and move and momentum? How does it feel?
It's a mixed bag. It's a mixed bag. You're right. Back in the 2012 kind of around then, it was just like it was the thing to do. I mean, it was like this fun, like how can we think of a wall assembly? And it was this crazy origami, and everyone's trying to think of ways that they can come up with the best assembly and save this energy. And it was getting national recognition, and it was just really like taking off, and it was awesome. And then I feel like from around 2015 or so, it just kind of like there was a lot of like, why should we go to Passive House? I don't want the certification. I just want, zero energy. And, Hammer and Hand kind of pivoted, Sam moved along. And so they weren't quite the driving force that, they used to be, which kind of left it in, there's two other teams in town that were still kind of moving along with that. I mean, there's certainly more, but teams that were doing it, focusing on it was Birdsmouth, our team, and along with Greenhammer, Design-Build. And, Greenhammer had a bunch of really great Passive House projects that they were doing around that same time that Hammer and Hand was. But they kind of, did the similar thing where suddenly it was just like you weren't hearing Passive House as much. It was more of like the zero energy thing, and they do great work. They really do. But there wasn't a lot of like Passive House innovation that was happening there. And we did a handful of projects, like one or two, but it was hard to get our clients to really go for it. Yet we're watching, we're looking at the East Coast with New York and NYSERDA and most recently Mass Saves and the stuff that's happening in Massachusetts, and looking up north of us, looking at Vancouver, BC, and they're just making huge. It's like they never got off that initial like excitement that we had in Portland. And a few years ago, it was kind of like, gosh, whatever happened to the Passive House movement? Like, was that, what was that? But in the last like year or two, we're starting to see more and more of it coming back around here in Portland, not to the levels that I would like to see. Certainly we're doing our part, trying to do our part. But maybe in Seattle, I think you were mentioning, kind of feels kind of similar. Maybe
it does feel similar. I think that, I think that part of what's been happening in Seattle also is that the International Living Future Institute is based here, and so a lot of the policy making that happened around green building, and really kind of the most ambitious incentives and around green building were focused on living buildings, which is great. But Passive House was less of a focus. I do think, though, like you say, that things are shifting. Sloan Ritchie of Cascade Build deserves a ton of credit for this. I think that he has been demonstrating proof of concept like there's no tomorrow around a Passive House multifamily. And so there are other teams that are involved. There's some incentive dollars from Seattle City Light connected to Passive House and in the affordable housing space, which has been good. And influence from Passive House on the development of energy code. But again, I also look north of the border at Vancouver and with jealousy to just about what's going on there. It's interesting how things kind of ebb and flow. But I do think that speaks to the importance of what an impact a practitioner can have in a space. And I think so the work that you're doing in Portland, I mean, I think that it's cool that your story is getting out nationally as well, through you're with that intentionality that you have on storytelling, and the new podcast and all the stuff that you're doing with Fine Home Building. But it also, I think, is having an impact in your city, right? And it may not be easy to see that, but it does, I think. As we kind of plant more of these seeds, they end up growing and having ripple effects that we don't necessarily anticipate.
I think we'll see more and more of it. I know for ourselves, like our baseline building, which is just a 2x6 wall with exterior insulation, nice windows, airtight with efficient ERV, which to me at this point is just building. It really isn't like that. It's not rocket science. And, we've been finding that with the new FIAS standard, so FIAS updates their standard every 3 years or so, and they take into account the cost of renewables and stuff like that. And they've been lessening up on some of the envelope requirements, but being very, strict about the resilience, indoor air quality, durability. They're not letting that go within their methodology. And so what we found is just like a year or two ago is like, gosh, a lot of the houses that we're designing are just easy, like, shoo-ins for this FIAS program. And so what we've been doing is there's some Energy Trust of Oregon incentives that more than pay for the cost of certification. And we're doing energy modeling as a baseline with our new builds anyways. And we're using the Woofy Passive for that. And so, we simply just say like, well, listen, your house is basically a shoe-in for passive house anyway. We'll take care of the certification costs because we get this incentive. We're doing energy modeling anyways. So are you game? And our clients lately have been like, yeah, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, of course.
And so I think that that's gonna, my point with this is I think that, we're gonna see that as the general level of building in our industry goes up, and the, FIAS especially working with their protocols, we're going to find that that's going to intersect more and more. And I think we're going to see more and more passive buildings happening. I certainly know there's a lot of, here in Portland, I get a lot of people calling me up saying, hey, we want to do passive house, or other teams that are wanting to get to passive house and want to do some consulting or have questions. It's on the tip of a lot of people's tongues now, more so than in the last few years. And so I do think that like you said, I think there's some seeds being planted.
Yeah. Yeah. And there will be ways that we can probably leverage the new IRA money from the Inflation Reduction Act to help get closer and closer. Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. Well, this is great. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up?
Not really. It's nice catching up with you. I mean, you're one of the, the original Portland kind of passive house crew here that's part of Hammer and Hand. And, it's great to see what you're doing with the accelerator and all the impact that's having. And it's nice to be able to have this conversation. So, I don't know, keep up the good work, and I'll endeavor to do the same down here.
Hey, well, it's inspiring work. And I was at the right place at the right time, learned from a lot of really great people that you've named during the podcast. So it's been fun to reminisce, and fantastic work, Josh.
Cheers. Thank you.
And that was Josh Salinger of Birdsmouth Design and Build, as you pointed out towards the end there. Great story of how Josh and his team got to that stage. I just love that story. I feel like I'm at risk of having a midlife crisis and going back and becoming a carpenter if I listen to two more of these interviews.
Yeah, I was finding at the very beginning of the interview when he was talking about his fond memories of his dad building and stuff. I remember having memories of being on the site with when my dad was building and playing with the scraps of wood that were, are kind of ubiquitous on job sites during construction. Yeah,
me too. All I could think about was the hours and hours that I spent in the shed, either with Dad or doing stuff that Dad had taught me, and the smell and the feel of playing with wood. And then recently going back to my childhood home where my parents still live, and finding all this stuff that I'd made as fairly young.
That's cool.
Just thinking, wow, I loved. I developed this love of wood pretty early on, and I could totally relate to that story that Josh was telling of loving carpentry. But the other thing that stood out for me, I think, was that time with his dad, and just how that made it a really enjoyable experience. Just hanging out, building decks, or it was just time away, and obviously made a big impact, because he did go to college. He got a degree, but then it came back to building and to carpentry, but never lost sight, and I think was re-inspired by the opportunity that Passive House provided to be scientific about the art of carpentry.
Yeah, it was that moment of like not quite feeling like the green building of the time, the sort of low VOC, no VOC paint and clay and that stuff was really getting where you wanted it to be. Yeah,
and the distinction between passive solar and then
right.
and then coming across things like airtightness and that all starting to make sense.
Yeah. And I think that's what I mean. That heady time. I mean, so there were other builders. I mean, he mentioned the late Sam Hagerman, who was the co-founder of Hammer in Hand. He was also discovering, this. I mean, you called it the unified field theory of building. Essentially, is how we describe Passive House. Yeah, because it brought together all these things that some kind of intuitions and learnings that were kind of felt disparate and put it together and like in this package and informed by physics. Yeah.
We've had a string of people on the podcast who were inspired by some house tours all around the same time. And a lot of that points to CAT and those early days of showing really a couple of the first examples of Passive House in North America, and people being really changed by that. That's been the origin story for quite a lot of people who got to experience just some of those first forays into that in that part of the world, and just thinking, oh, well, this is it, and taking it and running with it. And then the influence of people like Joe Stebrook, who Josh mentioned as well. And the other thing that keeps popping up is that 2008. I don't know what it was. Yeah. Well, I do know. We do know what it was about. That just kind of keeps coming up as such a pivotal time for so many people.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, back to the home tours. I think it's just a reminder for everybody. Sometimes I think it's if you dedicate a big chunk of your life to build a single building, and it can feel like, oh man, we need to be doing more, which is, of course, we always wanted to be doing more. But those examples have really outsized effects, I think, on impacting others and inspiring others. And that was one thing that was heartening to hear, that there's a feeling, on a sense from on where he sits, that Portland there's a kind of another wave coming, and I think that he's playing an important role in making that possible by continuing to show built examples of these buildings. One
of the things that I often struggle with is where to have the most influence. What could I be doing that has the most impact? And I often think back to Daniel Kress and his story about being a builder, and then thinking, oh, that's just not enough, and then becoming a designer, because you can design more buildings than you can build in a year, and then thinking, well, that's not enough, and then eventually becoming an educator, because then he could influence more and more people put on his courses, which is where he's at now. And I really like Josh's story around getting to the stage where he is now, keeping the company at a financially sustainable level, but allowing him the flexibility to go out and do things like talk to you, or go to conferences and go and share that story for that purpose of having a greater influence far beyond the 3 houses that they might build in a year. And I think that's a really interesting way of looking at that and thinking, well, it's not just about those 3 houses. The potential for influencing is so much greater than that.
Yeah, well said. I mean, because you could imagine building a certain number of houses and saying, I want to make more impact, and then figuring, okay, so we need to triple in size so we can make three times more buildings. But his insight was, no, actually, this is what we need to do is be right where we're at, because that allows us to carve this time and space out to share the stories, and then also to bring on people like Ryan Shanahan and talk, share the retrofit story. And it's great to see the kind of relationship that they're building with Fine Home Building magazine as well, which is with the articles that he's publishing there, and the video work that we alluded to, and then of course the podcast, the new
podcast coming out. That sounds very exciting, and it's a very worthy focus area of retrofits and figuring out what are we going to do with all these existing houses that are a big drain on resources ongoing, from an energy point of view. And they also have a lot of embodied energy and embodied carbon in them. So how do we make use of what is there, but improve them so they don't consume as much, but also are better places to be. And it's going to require, I think, the skills and experience of people like Josh, because it's hard. It's a lot easier to build in a blank piece of land, and to do that well, but it's much harder to start pulling things off an existing building and uncovering all sorts of interesting changes that have already been done over the years, and figuring out solutions on the fly. And making old buildings airtight is a lot more work than doing that in an integrated way from the start of a new one.
And I know that Ryan has personal experience with this. I mean, he has a vast experience because of Ryan Shanahan, who was at Earth Advantage. He has a lot of experience because of his work at Earth Advantage, but he also lives in an old Portland house. I saw a video that he produced about this that he's retrofitted to be a high performance home. So there's some
need more examples of those. I look forward to a house tour of retrofits. That would be awesome.
Yeah, no doubt.
I also just have to highlight the I can't remember what the terminology was, but the no concrete slab.
Yes.
Which you've highlighted. I think you've done a session on the accelerator on that, so people can go and check out those videos.
Yep, I'll include a link to that video. Yep.
Because when I heard that, I was like, well, that doesn't seem innovative. I mean, that's just called a suspended timber floor. That's what we used to do before concrete, but it's totally different from that.
Right. Yeah.
It kind of looks and feels like a slab. It's a solid floor, but using sort of compacted aggregate and then an insulation layer and then timber over the back. So it's a solid floor, but without concrete.
Yeah.
Is that a good summary?
Yep. No, it is a good summary. And I thought I was entertained by the fact that he was like, well, you guys don't get too excited about that. It's, we're doing other things here, this is not the solution everywhere. So it's just this indication of, or signals kind of his innovative spirit, right? It's like, well, this is a really cool solution that really works great in these conditions. And then there's this other thing we're working on right now that works in these other conditions, so it's good.
Awesome stuff. Very, very inspiring. And I do miss picking up a hammer and making stuff.
Yeah. My brother is the one who actually followed through on continuing the building line in my family, Eli Semke. Yeah. I
awesome.
Just watch the product of that labor.
Well, and we'll keep in touch. Josh is obviously doing some great things, and as we mentioned, it's got the new podcast coming out next year with Fine Building. So definitely keep an eye out on that. All right. What else have people got to keep an eye out on?
Yeah, well, we are wrapping up 2022. It's been quite the year, pretty amazing. We just did our last event today as we're recording this. We did our last component spotlight today. So we're taking a couple of weeks off on live programming, but we are going to ramp back up on the second Wednesday of January. And we have some changes that we're making to the Passive House Accelerator live lineup, which we're all very excited about. So What we're going to be doing is a couple of things. One, we're adding 2 series to the lineup. So on the first Wednesday of every month, except for January, because we're still on holiday. On the first Wednesday, we'll have the 101 series, which will be focused on things like how to design your first passive house, which is what will be the topic in February, or how to build your first passive house. Those sorts of topics, we'll be doing those the first Wednesday of every month. The second Wednesday of every month, we'll have our Next Gen series, which is based on the concept of like 40 under 40. So this is basically young, badass practitioners of passive house will be presenting, and that is going to be co-hosted by Zoe Kaufman of NREL and Carmel Pratt of Bright Power. And so that's going to happen every second Wednesday. Oh, I should say the host of the first Wednesday will be Jose Rueda Sosa, who has been based in New York City for a while now. He's actually in London. He's also with Bright Power, coincidentally. The third Wednesday of the month, we'll do a project showcase, which will be hosted by Beverly Craig. And the fourth Wednesday of the month, we'll have Construction Tech, which is hosted by Kevin Brennan, Mark Willey, Sean St. Amour, and Shannon Pendleton. The other key thing is that we're changing the time. So we're moving from 7 p.m. Eastern to noon Eastern for all of our Passive House Accelerator live programming on Wednesdays. So that means 9 a.m. Pacific, and it puts the time in a really awkward spot for you in New Zealand and Australia. So we're working on some ideas for programming for you all down under.
Yeah. That's quite a lot. There's a lot
join us. Yeah, right. So the next step is the second Wednesday of January. We will kick off programming with our first episode of the Next Gen edition.
And as always, check out passivehouseaccelerator.com, and if you haven't already, signed up to the newsletter, and that way you'll get that and more information sent to your inbox, so you can stay in touch with what's going on.
Yeah.
Exciting stuff. Well, thank you, Zack.
Thank you, Matthew.
We'll be back again next week. Have a great Christmas in the meantime, but we will be going on through the break, and we've got another great interview coming next week for the last one for 2022. So until then, have a great week, and we'll be back again then on Passive House Podcast.
And happy Hanukkah.